We're right on time to get started. And I think while people are coming in, I'm just going to provide some entertainment while people are taking their seats. If you're interested, the guest Wi-Fi is this, AU exclamation, and it's case sensitive. And I'm going to show it again in a couple minutes when more people are in. And take that down. And we'll go back to it if you don't have it quite yet. Got it? Who needs it? All right, let's go. So about a month ago, I was at the Getty and with Henry Wilhelm. If you don't know Henry, he's done probably more to advance the cause of film preservation, photograph preservation than anybody else in the world. And so this thing caught my eye. I should have been a hand model, right? I get that all the time. People say, yeah. But, you know, it's this handbag, and it's made of slides from the Getty collection, the study collection. There it is. You know, and it's kind of struck me, you know, the new, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot here in terms to unpack maybe. But, you know, for the history of man, you know, if you wanted to make an image, you had to have materials, you know. It was, and we're in the middle of this transition where images and materials don't necessarily have to coexist. And it seems sort of, in a way, in that context, it's very exciting, I think. Incredibly exciting time to be a conservator and just to be, you know, an observer of culture. But it's also a little irreverent, you know? I mean, it gets back to the Mad Men clip that Susan showed, I think, you know? I mean, certainly my childhood was documented on 35 millimeter color slides. Not that that's any great anything, but, you know, but at the time it seemed so modern, and, you know, now it's, the new society is, the new culture, visual culture anyway, is kind of gleefully building on the bones of the old, and it is sort of a poignant moment. And yeah, I didn't buy the handbag. It was $150. Anyway, I guess everybody's in by now. So let's get started. Oh, one more announcement. Well, let's just go back to the Wi-Fi password for those who need it. Also, white iPhone. If anybody lost their iPhone, I guess it's just going to be up here at the podium. So, and by the way, my name is Paul Messier. I'm a conservator in private practice working in Boston. And it's a great a privilege, really, to have this opportunity to be here today. I mean, I've really found the morning's discussions to be incredibly interesting, provocative, and I'm sure we're in store for a lot more good stuff. Speaking of which, we're going to go right to the first presentation of the afternoon session, and that is by Kate Jennings, and I've got her bio here somewhere. So, Kate Jennings is a time-based media conservator at Tate, where she has worked since 2005. She completed a BA in the History of Art at the Courtauld Institute of Art, London University, before training as a paper conservator and receiving an MA from the University of Northumbria at Newcastle upon Tyne, UK. Her professional experience includes a 2-year Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship at the Advanced Residency Program in Photograph Conservation at the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York. So, Kate. Let's see if I know what I'm doing here. Do you know where yours is? Did I just screw that up?
Maybe it's underneath. Just underneath.
I keep looking for it.
I hate this touch.
Yeah, me too. Jeffrey, or Jeff, Martin. But this is my feeble attempt at entertainment. Now we need real stuff. Sorry, it must be up here somewhere.
It sure is. Right there.
There you go.
Yep. There one goes. You're welcome.
Presenter mode, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Herschel. There it is. Slideshow. Presenter view. Looks good.
Thank
And
you.
this is the one I want to make sure you can read.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank Jeff Martin and the Tech Planning Group for inviting me to be here, and to the Smithsonian for funding my visit. In the next half hour, I'm going to talk briefly about how Tate acquires film-based artworks. So I'm going to start by just giving you a little introduction to the Tate and how we work, so that's the context that we'll work in. And then I'm going to take you step by step through the processes that we go through at acquisition, and then I'm going to present a couple of case studies. So, the Tate consists of one collection, but it can be shown across 4 sites which are spread around the UK. And it's loaned nationally and internationally. When Tate opened in 1897, its collection consisted of 65 works gifted to the British nation by Henry Tate, who was a sugar magnate. Today, the collection consists of approximately 70,000 works of art by more than 3,000 artists. And I work in the time-based media department at Tate. There's 8 of us, and we are responsible for the conservation of film, slides, video, audio, performance, and software-based artworks. And there's 3 of us whose remit includes the acquisition of time-based media works. So today, the Tate has 62 accessioned film works in its collection, or works that incorporate a film element. The first piece was acquired in 1973, and this was Dan Graham's 2 correlated rotations. However, in the last 6 years alone, it has acquired 53 film works, and 14 of these were in the last year. The majority is 16mm, mainly single-screen installations, but we also have some double and a 5-screen projection work. Half of the artists are British and include, as we've talked about earlier today, Tasta Dean, Liz Rhodes, John Smith, Guy Sherwin, and internationally includes Gusmao Paiva, Darian Martin, Florian Pumhauser, and Matthew Buckingham. All the film works owned by Tate are editions, so we do not hold any artists' original negatives or masters. And at present, we don't hold any artist archives. And as our oldest work is 73, we only have film elements on acetate and polyester. The vast majority is 16mm, but we do have a couple of elements on 8, Super 16, and 35mm. And we also have a cold storage where we keep our film. So at acquisition, we consider both the long-term preservation of the media, but also how the artwork behaves in its installed state. Acquisition is also about securing the ability to display the artwork, so making sure you have the correct elements for printing exhibition reels and ensuring you have the right equipment that is appropriate to show the work, that meets the requirements of the artist. Over the last 16 years, we've gradually built up an equipment pool for 60mm works, and we have approximately 33 halogen projectors, 13 loopers, 3 16mm xenon projectors, and a couple of synchronizing systems. And Tate usually has at least 1 60mm film work on display at any one time across its various museums. So, my first question at acquisition is, what is it? This sounds simple enough, but unfortunately in practical terms, this is not always clear, particularly as I'm often presented with a list of artworks I've never actually had a chance to see in their installed state. So, I start by talking to the curator and reading up on the artwork and the artist. And then we break our thoughts down into kind of this simple structure. And at its essence, we think first about the media, so how is it shot, how is it edited, and what film masters does the artist or the representative have, which is kind of what Maurice and people talked about this morning. And then also we think about the display. What is the display format, and how does that work behave in its installed state. In order to answer some of these questions, we'll start a dialogue with the seller, which could be the gallery or the artist or somebody who's giving it as a gift, to kind of begin teasing out these technical questions. And then we also inquire whether the gallery or artist has a preferred film lab, and if they have a reference print for grading, or timing, as you say in the US. So, if you understand how the work was shot and edited, and how it's displayed in its installed state, this can then help you kind of think in your mind how you're going to create a sort of preservation strategy for a particular work. So I kind of had to think about our film collection, and I've sort of broken them down into 5 little families. So these are just sort of random things that I've come up with. So I've called, my first group is film to film. So this is mainly contemporary works that are shot on film and projected as film, so somebody like Tasta Dean, or Dario Martin. Then we've got digital to film, so these are works that are produced digitally and then printed back onto film and projected as film in the gallery. Then I've got a group that I've called 1970s Films Revisited. These are works that are mainly shot in the 70s, were shown non-commercially, and today they're being sold as editions, and quite often only one vintage print survives. Then I've got performance to gallery, again, generally from the 70s, when the work was conceived, shown by the artist as a performance, but now these works are being reinterpreted and sort of brought into a sort of museum environment where you wouldn't really necessarily show it as a one-off performance, so working with the artist there. And then my last group is film and or video, question mark. So these are works that were shot on film and have been shown on film, but now the artist is kind of saying, well, it could be shown as film or video, just to make it more confusing. So maybe you know what you're getting. So you know what the work is, so now the question is, what are you getting? This also is not always clear when we're presented with an acquisition. So again, I start talking to the curator in the gallery. And there is no standard. And what is being offered often depends on whether the artist and gallery have sold film works before, or whether they've sold works to a museum before. Because some artists, you know, they don't use film, but they use it for a one-off piece. So they're not really thinking about it. So what are you going to get? Are you going to get a print? Are you going to get an internegative? And if there's sound, you're going to get a sound master. Then, depending on what is being offered for the purchase price or gift, we then think about whether Tate would need any additional material. So, what do you need? Like Maurice, I'm rather fond of production diagrams, so I'm going to start one off here. So to answer this, you need to establish what the artist master is. It could be a negative, it's often a print, and sometimes it's an interpositive. And I'm going to take you through here the sort of material that Tate would ideally acquire where an artist master is a negative and the work incorporates sound. So the black boxes that you can see on the screen represent film elements that Tate will not be given, but which we would request access to in order to print what we would feel necessary for both the long-term printing of the work and its long-term preservation. On the bottom left, I've got a reference print, which I mentioned earlier, and if one exists, you may need to temporarily borrow this until all the archive material is accurately produced, at which point you would then return that to the artist or the gallery. This would be a print approved by the artist as having the correct visual appearance for display, and therefore will be used as the reference to match the colour and the light of the prints. If one is available, it's also good to find out what it's been made from. So, you know, the artist cut negative or from an internegative, because then this also helps you how close you can actually match your material. So the first things that we'd start making would be we'd make an interpositive from our negative master, and from the artist sound master we want to make a master, so it would be either a WAV file, which is an uncompressed audio file, or a DAT tape. The next thing we do is we make our if it's 16mm, we make our 16mm optical sound master, and then ideally we'd make 2 internegatives from the interpositive. And then we would make answer prints from each of our internegatives, which would be graded working with the reference print. And then finally, we'd also make an exhibition print because we'd want to keep the answer prints. We don't want to use those for projection. So for access purposes or tests for displays and curators, we'll always make at least 1 exhibition print. I've highlighted internegative B and answer print B because those are not, strictly speaking, necessary. I think if you have all the other material, that is great. But we try to go for a sort of belts and braces approach at the Tate, and we have found in the past that, you know, when you print into negative, if it's used a lot, it gets very worn out and tired, and the sprocket holes sort of begin to go. We do have a few works where that's happened because they're very popular and we've printed a lot. So we thought it's quite nice to have 2 internegatives, particularly if you don't have an interpositive and you don't have anything else you can go back to. But I would say that if you're a smaller institution and money's an issue and all that kind of stuff, that's something that you could just sort of let go of. This is one of our production diagrams that we use for nearly all our time-based media works at the Tate, for video, slide and software-based artworks. And we really like it because it visually makes very clear the history of the media of a particular piece. And we've also adopted a traffic light system to denote kind of levels of access. So the red is very, very important, shouldn't leave the Tate ever, sort of thing. And then the amber stuff is stuff that you need to use. So if you need to make prints, it needs to go to a lab. It's not going to be with you the whole time. So it's kind of proceed with caution. And then you've got your green stuff at the bottom, and then people will know that's kind of fine to kind of pick up off the shelf and use. So after research, lots of phone calls and emails, talking to galleries and artists and film labs, we then get to the point where hopefully we sufficiently understand the work so we're able to devise at least an initial acquisition strategy. So once you know how it was made and how it's shown and what's being offered, if what's being offered sort of physically falls short of what you think is reasonable to sustain the long-term preservation of the artwork, I think at that point it's time to negotiate with the gallery. So if they're just offering prints, that means you can't print in the future. So what does that mean? You know, can you sort of discuss that and get some internegatives and sound masters? And in other cases, we've been offered an internegative and a print, but the work has sound, so obviously you need to have your sound master as well. At Tate, we're required to compile an initial pre-acquisition report that's presented to the Tate's acquisition committee prior to them officially confirming an acquisition. And very briefly, it's kind of almost like a one-page report. This sort of condenses all of that technical information, and it includes any necessary costs which might involve creating additional material which is needed, which is not being offered by the acquisition, and also cost implications if we don't have the right equipment to show the work. So your acquisition is approved, then you need to work with the artist and the film lab. Commonly, artists establish a working relationship with specific film labs which produce most of their work. So it's often a really good option to basically make all your material with that lab. The artist's original material is also frequently held by the film lab, so it also means that you can avoid shipping the master material. And for this reason, we've worked with multiple labs across North America, the UK and Europe. And in many ways, if the lab is not in London, it really doesn't make much difference where they are because you've got to ship anyway. So just very briefly, shipping, we use companies like FedEx. We never ship over a weekend. We always do in and out forms at Tate, which we scan and then send to the lab and the artist that we're working with, and we check that the material arrives. So basically everything is very carefully logged so we can track where things are, because as Maurice pointed out this morning, can take a really long time to do this work. If the artist is not going to be doing the grading in person, it's kind of 50-50 with that, we make sure that the reference print is also sent to the film lab when producing the material. So they have the visual reference to match to the prints. We always ask for our material to be printed on polyester stock, and if possible, we ask the lab to produce the prints on the same manufacturing stock as the reference print. But today, this is becoming much more challenging. And we also like to put the LAD strip, which Maurice mentioned this morning, the laboratory density aim patch, and we ask for that to be spliced onto our first film element, and then that can be printed through all those generations, and it can be used for grading and quality control. So, the lab's made the prints, made the negatives and everything, and then that comes back to the Tate. So at that point, you need to check your material. So we do this by projecting the reference print next to the answer print that the lab has produced for us. We have 2 projectors that we keep clean, that we check with clear leader before we start running this material through them, and we also have amplifiers and speakers so we can check the sound properly. The only way to really assess your prints are to project them side by side. And, you know, these works are all being shown in the gallery, and you can only really see the detail when it's blown up. No 2 projectors are the same, but we get as close as we can using the same model and new lamps. So allowances do need to be made, but this still basically gives you the best comparison. And for us, it's really important when we're making our answer print, so our reference print for future printing, because we want to get that as close as is possible. And so the only way you can really see it is by projecting it. And then once we've confirmed that answer print, then we can send the reference print back to the artist. So grading or timing can often be a very long process. And in the past, we have had works where we've gone through at least 3 prints before we've reached the best match. This is not always the case, but it's certainly not uncommon. So once the grading and the timing is settled, as was mentioned this morning, we would ask for the punch tapes and also the table of data containing the printer's lights and the exact frame at which each scene starts and the printer's lights change. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies from the collection. So this is my group film to film. So here she is, Tasta Dean, shooting her film, and there she is in her lab with her Steenbeck editing a piece called Film that was at Tate, which we saw earlier today. So she really, as Jeff said, takes it through all the way as film. This is a still image of one of her pieces called Disappearance at Sea, and which is an anamorphic 16mm projection. And on the right, you can't read the detail, but that is one of our production diagrams for this. Well, that is our production diagram for this work. You can see there's lots of green. It's a very popular work, and we've printed it a lot of times. This was on display about 4 years ago at Tate Modern, and we had to sort of go back and regrade the work, which was a very laborious process because Tass is very particular about the pinks and the oranges and the yellows in the sunset, so we spent a lot of time in the dark thinking about pink and orange. But we got there in the end. This is part of my digital to film group, and I'm just gonna, it's probably slightly sacrilegious, but I haven't brought any 16mm film with me, so I've just got some little short videos. So this is, I'm just gonna give you a few seconds of basically what you see when this work projects. This is a work by Simon Starling called D1Z1, and it's about a computer and 35mm film. Z1 refers to arguably the first programmable computer made in the late 1930s by Konrad Zuse, and a mid-century 35mm film projector known as the Dresden D1. And it's the D1, which you can see here on the screen, and that projects the 35mm film. And the connection is that Conrad used strips of blank 35mm film with holes punched in it, and then he fed that into his computer, and that's how it got programmed. So this work was digitally born. Simon Starling commissioned Al Lowfeld, a model maker and animator from ThoroughWorks in New York, to produce a 3D model of Zeus's computer based on archival photos that he'd found and he sent to this guy in New York. So the guy in New York made a digital 3D model, and then he was asked to produce short animation with sound. A whole array of software was used to create the model and the animation, and then finally this was all assembled and output as an uncompressed HD movie file at 1920 by 1080 and 24 frames per second. And the audio track was supplied separate as a master WAV file. So this is the production diagram for this work, and you can see the stuff in black is either stuff that we don't own, or it's an explanation of the history or what's happened with the media, which then kind of explains the things that we have in the traffic light colours that Tate does have, and kind of explains where they've come from and why they were made and at what time. And then just below here you can see this is a page from an installation manual that was made by my colleague Jake Asprey, and this was compiled as this work was installed at Tate St Ives last year. He made this very detailed manual explaining exactly how to set this up. And basically it's a modified D1 projector, and it's a looper, and these long strips of film at the bottom is essentially the looper. It's 30 seconds long, and what the image is showing here, it's a little bit blurry, but the strip of punch tape that's travelling through the computer must be projected like for like, the same width as a 35mm film, and that's how you know how to set that projection up. So 1970s film revisited. This is a work by a Scottish artist called Bruce MacLean, and it's called In the Shadow of Your Smile, Bob. He's rather obsessed with Robert Morris, and it's all about him. This work was shot on 16mm black and white film in the 1970s, and he showed it in the 70s, and I think it was very briefly distributed, but it was never shown commercially. Bruce MacLean's not known for his films, he's known for his sculpture and photography. So when I spoke to the gallery at acquisition, I discovered that only a 1970s print with a magnetic film strip, and it was all on acetate base, existed. So I had long discussions with the gallery and with the film lab that the gallery liked to work with about what needed to be done. And it became quite clear that the gallery had talked to the film lab to get a quote for sort of the material that they thought they wanted, but they'd sort of missed out the fact that they needed a soundtrack. And so in the end, I kind of ended up basically advising what needed to be done and liaised between the gallery and the film lab to make sure that we got what we wanted, but also actually the gallery had some master material that they could then use in the future, so they didn't have to keep going back to this original print by the artist. The artist lives in the UK, but he wasn't interested, although he says it's a film work, he wasn't interested in being involved in the grading. And actually a colleague of his, John Smith, who also makes films, I'm going to mention later, he actually ended up doing the grading. And I'm sure most of you know you need to grade black and white film as much as you do with colour. So John Smith actually went to the lab and looked at the original print and then looked at what we got. So although we didn't have that original print to look at when it came back to Tate, we still looked at both of our answer prints and checked what, you know, whether they kind of matched each other up. So the next piece is in my group called Performance to Gallery. So this is a piece called Light Music from 1975 by a British artist called Liz Rhodes. And I'm just going to give you a little... I can find the mouse. A little sample of this. So that was down in the oil tanks at Tate Modern when it was still a construction site. That's why people are wearing hard hats. It's nothing to do with the artwork. This is just being acquired by Tate at the moment, and it's about to go and display in the oil tanks again. That was a video from back in 2009. And this is a piece where the image and the sound are the same. The image makes the sound, hence why it's got that kind of quite weird sort of sound to it, and why it's called light music. This is a performance piece, and the artist has only ever shown it as a performance. So she would set it up, the two projectors face each other. She might have a friend at one end, and she'd turn it on, and if she didn't have a friend, she'd run down the other end and turn it on, and then it would run for 25 minutes. Both of the projections it's the same footage, but it's edited in a slightly different way. And it just kind of ran, and then, you know, we were talking about smoking earlier in the gallery. I think Kerry was mentioning that. You know, people would smoke, there'd be smoke, kind of the idea of expanded cinema on the third screen. And people are kind of, the idea is that you walk through and interact with the work. So it's very much a performance. And Tate's buying this work. So basically with this particular work, the acquisition is more about the display than it is about the material. So it's kind of working out with the artist how this can actually be shown in a gallery, because at the Tate, quite like to show film works, and it might be on display for 3 months, 6 months, or a year. And unfortunately, we can't have two people turning it on every 25 minutes and rewinding it, because it's not very practical. So we use loopers, so it can kind of constantly loop. And so we've had long discussions with Liz about how it should work in a museum setting. And I thought that she would kind of want to kind of keep it very much as it was, but she is tweaking things as we do little test setups for her and show her the loopers and how that, as you can see, the light really reflects, sorry, it's just not a great picture, but the light really reflects on the equipment that have kind of sculptural kind of presence in that image. But when she looked at the loopers and the synchronizing system, she's like, that's quite ugly, I really don't want to see that. So she's kind of made some changes where we're going to lift the screens up slightly. So although the equipment will still be there sitting on the floor, they won't actually be encroaching on the projection. And for her, that's how she wants it to be. So it's quite interesting seeing her going through that process and kind of capturing all of that information, because it is very much kind of changing the work. So this is in my group, film and or video. So I'm just going to run a little clip of this. This is The Girl Chewing Gum by John Smith. That's one of my favourite pieces. So this was made in 1976. John Smith makes films. It was shot as film. It's been shown as film many times. And when this was acquired by Tate in 2010, it was archived as a film-based artwork, but also we were supplied with an HD Cam SR tape, and it said in the installation instructions that this also could be shown as video. At Tate, there's very much a sense that film should be shown as film, and we do our utmost to show artworks as film. But when there's a little bit of flexibility, so when an artist says, oh, it could also be shown as video, somebody raised the question earlier, the cost of printing. It is really expensive to make film prints. You know, they run in the gallery. I mean, somebody will be talking about this tomorrow. They run in the gallery. At Tate Modern, it's very dirty. Lots of people visit. We need to change prints at least once a month as they're constantly travelling through the loopers. Tate Modern is open 7 days a week. So there's a lot of wear on the prints. So it's quite expensive to kind of maintain that. So this is an installation shot of it being shown on Blu-ray. At Tate Britain last year, the curators decided, well, as there's the option and the artist is okay with that, it's a lot cheaper for us to set up. And he was fine with it. But anyway, that's an installation shot. This is the production diagram for this particular work, and as you can see, it's rather kind of complex. But I'm quite glad that it is in a diagram because it actually helps kind of get your head around the complexity. And the reason why there are so many kind of loops and offshoots is because we did the traditional archiving as film, and then he supplied us with an HD Cam SR master, which he said was 24 frames per second. And then when we came to test it and show it, he came into the gallery and went, no, 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 that's all wrong. The sound's not right. There's something wrong with it. And then he had this kind of residual memory that when he shot it at the RCA, the Royal College of Art in London in 1976, that the camera he'd used had actually been adapted and it had been shot at 25 frames per second rather than 24. So then he went back, he took the HD Cam master back, and he went into post-production again, and he re-edited his master, tweaked the sound, changed the frames per second, and then presented us with a new thing. But it was really complicated because he's not really digital. We were talking to another lab that were doing the digital work in London. It was based on this kind of memory from 1976. So we've tried to kind of capture here what we think happened when and when. I mean, we've kind of recorded an interview with the artist, but when they start kind of going around in circles and then going, oh, no, but actually this happened then. So this is really useful. So Tacita, I can't really finish without talking about Tacita, although I kind of feel she's been quite well covered this morning. This is, as you all know, I'm just going to let this run actually, because again, Tacita would not be happy about this, but here we go. I'm going to let this run in the background. This is a silent piece, 35mm colour and black and white, portrait format, anamorphic film with hand-tinted sequences, and it's mute. This was at the Turbine Hall for 6 months. It closed in March earlier this year, and Susan used a quote that I was also going to use about Soho Film Lab shutting down in London on the 22nd of February in 2011 last year. And this was the one surviving commercial film lab in London that printed 16mm film, where lots of artists went and also lots of museums used. And that was it. They shut down. There is now no commercial 16mm lab printing film in London. There is a film restoration lab called Prestec, run by João Oliveri, who we work with a lot because he's fantastic, knows a lot about film, but he's not really a commercial lab. This was really, certainly in the UK, but clearly internationally, her work and also the book that she published was really a kind of a call to arms to kind of speak up for the value and the importance of film in the light of an industry which is kind of beyond our control. Tacita wrote in her book, "Artists care about the uniqueness and aura of their objects and their presence in the spaces they are shown in, whether it is a silver gelatin photograph or a digital print, a 16mm film or a digital video. Artists understand and choose the medium carefully." Thank you.
5 minutes or so for questions. Any questions? Okay.
How are you addressing the concerns with the digital-based work in terms of migrating DVDs to HD, to solids, hard drives, servers?
Are you talking about Filmworks or?
Digital media that you might have.
Well, it depends what it is. So, so with the Simon Starling, the masters are uncompressed HD, and we're still working out the best way of doing it, because I think the needs of an art collection might be slightly different to the needs of a archive, and it's still not really clear, but we back up onto servers and LTO tapes, we run checksums, and we're looking into transcoding. So you get an HD uncompressed file for Final Cut Pro. So can you transcode that into something that's maybe open source and then test that now? Because it's one thing backing it up, but you're going to need to migrate it. So we're kind of running tests there. And then we're also looking at using things like MXF, but I certainly wouldn't like to talk about that because we've only done a few tests and it was all a bit weird. But so I still need to learn a lot more about that. But it's something that we're actively working on, but we don't really have an answer.
Just a quick question. I was curious about the grading image that was up before you went to the case studies, and what your thoughts were about that comparison.
Yes, sorry, I didn't talk about that. I missed that one. That was, if we stop that, we can go back. Maybe not. That was, anyway, a piece by Taster Dean called Michael Hamburger, and we had quite a few problems with the grading of that particular work. And what I was showing you, I mean, it's quite difficult because obviously they're digital stills of something that's moving on a screen, so it's not a really kind of good comparison. But what I was trying to show was that in the sky areas, here we go. In the sky areas, the blue is slightly different, and that was I think that was our reference print, and then one of the prints that had been made. So then we did go back to the lab. That was when there was a lab in London, so it was quite easy to deal with. We went back to the lab, and we did get it a bit closer. With that work, we also had problems with stabilization of the image. There are some shots where there's like a kind of gridded window structure, and as that played through the projector, there was this kind of like waving motion. I'm sure there's a lot more people here who could talk about it much better than I could because I don't really understand what was going on. But in the end, they had to reprint the print in a different way. They printed it like they printed a negative rather than a print, so it was kind of more stable.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. So coming from a curatorial angle, I'm really struck by the copious research you all are doing in each of the objects that comes into the tape collection. And I'm just interested what the mechanism is for capturing that research, and curious about whether your production diagrams and interviews and so forth automatically get transferred into a curatorial file, and if there are ways of making your research accessible for future generations of historians who will obviously benefit from it a great deal.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a lot of it's just kind of like random emails and sort of, we used to do very formal artist interviews and we still do those, but actually we're moving away from that less and less because it's basically an ongoing discussion. You acquire a work and then you don't really understand it until you fully install the work, which could be 2 years down the line, it could be 10 years down the line, so it's kind of an ongoing thing. So all of the emails are archived, we save them in the artwork folder, we print them out and we save the black and white printouts in the artwork folder. And if we're doing formal interviews, The curator's usually there. We usually have long discussions with the curator and maybe with the artists if we get the chance to talk to them. I'd say some of it could be kind of confidential because it's quite frank conversations. And we do audio recordings as well, but they're generally not sort of public use. But they're certainly there, kept at the Tate as a reference. The whole idea is it will be a reference for kind of future generations for how the hell do we reinterpret this with all this change in technology. But I'm sure it would be fine for people to read it. It would be great to document it more. We have so much, you know, like every institution, you're so busy, so we'd love to do like loads of sort of super lovely documentation, but we don't. So it is kind of kept in this kind of quite sort of basic way, and that's why our production diagram is quite important. But we don't really write anything formal.
Basically, right on time now, but this is going very well. Can you take another couple of questions? Just if you can make it brief, start. Not you. Sorry, behind.
Yes, for your C1, Z1 piece, you mentioned that there were quite a few software programs that control that piece to show. Did they acquire any of those programs? And if so,
No, we didn't, because essentially the work is a film work, we didn't acquire any of the software programs. If it's a software-based artwork, then we certainly do. But for that piece, it was a bit of a sort of head-scratching one, and there were a lot of discussions with the model maker in New York and with the artist to really work out what we wanted, because it's not like a formal structure in any way. You know, and did we want the Final Cut Pro project files and all that kind of stuff? Lots and lots of discussion about that. But in the end, we decided to kind of simplify it and go with the image master that could then be used to write to film, and then make the film elements. But yeah.
One thing that struck me a little bit is that you put on your color coding scheme, red, yellow, red and yellow, red and the high priority, that you had the internegative or the positive as a high priority and the weight bar. Why wouldn't the optical track be read also as a synonymous item in the picture?
Yeah, it's a good argument, and you know, we could make it red as well. I think it's a very good point. I think the reason why we've put it down as amber is actually we only normally make one optical soundtrack. So if that's going to get sent to a lab with the internegative, then it can kind of leave, and it's just to kind of denote that it's okay for it to leave the tape under controlled circumstances. But yeah, I mean, it is. What do you mean by not move forward?
Well, like you just say, well, we can't make it. We can't acquire this. It's not managing. It's not supposed to.
Well,
Because the stock is what we're seeing is not the right.
Yeah.
We're describing some of the colors or other things where you just. But maybe a step back from that would be when you have a mismatch because the stock doesn't exist. How do you grapple with that?
Well, we talk to the film labs a lot and get their advice to see what they think is really possible and what isn't possible. I always defer to the expert. Of course, as conservators, we want to look and make judgments as well. And I think, you know, all the artists that I mentioned are all alive, so that's quite useful as well, because we tend to be working with, you know, artists who are still around. So if there's a real problem, which we have had problems with, in the end, we either get the artist in and we're like, you come here the next time you're in London, I'm going to sit you down in front of a projector and you need to make the call, because they want the work to be in the collection and they want the work to be shown. Or, you know, we're saying to the artist, okay, you made a film work, go and find the film lab, you go and sit there and please can you go and make a decision. And we've gone round and round in circles, and then they say, oh, we can try this, and this is going to be done, and then it's sent to you, and it's not done, and then you go back again. But we always find a way in the end, because the artist always wants the work to work. But you make compromises, but it's kind of documenting those compromises and understanding why you're making those compromises, I think, is very important.
You said that when you acquire artworks into the collection, Tate Conservation stipulates the elements that you want to have in your collection. How involved are the conservators in the creation of those elements? You briefly mentioned that the conservator sits in when the grading is happening. Does that only pertain to the reference prints, or are you?
No, we don't sit in with the grading because it's done in the film lab, and normally it's being done in America or in Vienna or Berlin or something. We then get them to send the prints to us, and then we sit down and project them and look at them, and then talk to the lab on the phone if there are any problems.
So you basically just order or tell the gallery you want an IP, you want an IN, you want a reference print.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah,
You know,
okay.
it's a discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah.
Okay.